I'm really excited to be here. Today, we're going to talk about some of the ongoing research that I have been doing and recently published, as well as some of the recent publications. And for those who may have been in attendance last year or the year before, this is actually the third year I've given a talk. I wanted to build on some of those concepts. So we will go into a few of the topics that I've covered in the past, but if you're interested, you can find the video on YouTube uploaded through the New Mexico State University. And today, the information that I'll be presenting is covered in a book that I published last year called Gardening for Wildlife. It's a smaller book, it's only about 29 pages, but it covers a lot of information. And then later next month, a much larger book, about 150 pages, will be coming out, discussing everything that we cover in this presentation. So what we're going to go through today is we'll start off with some ecology, understanding landscapes and habitat loss, and then move on and talk about urbanization and recreating resources for wildlife. Then I'll step into some of the pollinators and landscapes and how those all interact, and then we'll finish up by talking about how to create habitat in urban areas. So to start off with, ecosystems are going to include habitats like meadows and forests, and depending on where you're at in the world, your ecosystem is going to have many different smaller environments inside of it. And a natural ecosystem is very different than a managed ecosystem because managed systems typically suspend plant and habitat succession. They change or regulate the interval of disturbance, and most often managers tend to prioritize habitat over ecosystem. So the populations that would typically be transient throughout time in an ecosystem get locked in place. And for example, we have Lee Meadows here in this picture, which is just outside of Las Vegas up on Mount Charleston. And this meadow has existed now for over 100 years. You can see that there's no seedlings, there's no saplings, where naturally this area would be invaded by the forest because that's what's supposed to happen in this ecosystem. But the management has stopped that from happening. If you've ever taken a biology or an ecology course or in some of the lectures that you've seen, you may have come across a model like this, which talks about pioneer plants and then everything moves towards a forest. It's very goal-oriented. And to be honest, it gives us a very wrong picture of what's going on. This model really only happens when you have a fresh lava flow or a huge landslide. But in most cases, you're dealing with a system that's a little bit more like this, but this is still incorrect. Because although this model shows you that there's a reset when something happens and the forest or the early shrublands can reset down to an herbaceous vegetation community, it really ignores how wildlife and how these ecosystems actually interact. So a more appropriate model would show that when there is a shifting event, be it flooding or fire, the wood and other resources from these vegetation communities persist, and then the vegetation resets. The vegetation community, if we're using it as our distinguishing factor of what makes that community, the model's fine. But when we start to think about wildlife, these resources that get left over, like dying wood, become extremely important to define our wildlife communities. And we typically ignore this when we're talking about conservation, and we'll highlight why that's some of the problem. To kind of drive this point home, there's this really great stop animation by Emily Fairfax that talks about beavers. And what I want you to take away from this stop motion is that beavers are ecosystem engineers. And when they start modifying things in the environment, they actually create new habitats. So as this beaver is damming up the river, it's going to let the water back up and create wetlands behind it. Any forest that is an upland forest is going to die at that point, and those trees are going to remain. This also is going to impact the way that shifting events will move through the ecosystem, such as fire, which is why this video was created. So when a fire comes through, those wetlands are protected, and you have a community shift nearby. Similarly, if this beaver were to pass away or get eaten or move, this dam would eventually break, drain those wetlands, and you would have another shifting event in the environment. To look at this in a more robust example, if we take a landscape aerial photo And you can see where people are managing these meadows or herbaceous communities next to forest, and shrublands have really disappeared. When a fire comes through, the forest doesn't burn all the way through. Really what's happening is that these herbaceous plant communities simply have more area that they can exist for a while. And you can see that the trunks of the trees are still quite present. So this model really is where I want people to start thinking about, as habitats change, these enforced ecosystems are going to have a lot more vegetation and structure than what we typically think about with previous models. Similarly with grasslands, when grasslands get burned, you still have a lot of biochar and other sticks and twigs that are going to impact the way various wildlife are going to be able to colonize those areas because of the resources they need for their life cycle. Surprisingly, even with the amount of fires that we've had throughout history, there are no good photo essays to show us what a recolonization or reforesting process looks like, but we can piece some things together. So in 1988, this area in the West Coast burned. And 11 years later, in 1999, when this photo was taken in the fall, you can see there's still a strong presence of herbaceous plants, a lot of standing tree trunks, and the trees are starting to grow back in. After about 25 years, the trees are about shrub height. You can see that the herbaceous plant community has really shifted to grasses, and there's not nearly as much area for that herbaceous and flowering plants, which is typically what a lot of folks want to have in their yard, or the homes and garden cover photos are really showing, which is this burst of color, lots of lush greenery. But again, in a natural setting, there's a lot of other resources that we're typically not having present in our gardens or conservation units. Even in this picture, you can see that birds have really decimated this tree here because beetle larvae are in there, and those beetle larvae are going to, of course, live in this environment, but the birds are feeding on it. So as we're going through this conversation and this presentation today, I want you all to think about the ecosystems around you and which resources would naturally exist there and which ones are we typically. No matter what ecosystem you are in, there is some level of transient vegetation communities that exist over time. Deserts have small sporadic rainfall. There are droughts happening on micro levels and then on annual and decade levels as well. That's going to affect vegetation communities throughout the landscape. Grasslands and forests have fires naturally, and now deserts, due to invasive species, are having fires as well, which is not a great thing. Climate change is really driving some of these factors as well, which again is not fabulous, but it is something that we have to deal with. And then there are pest outbreaks, all of which is going to change how these communities shift and how wildlife are able to interact with that environment. When we are thinking about areas that we want to improve and maybe rewild or turn into our small conservation unit or our little pollinator garden, it's important to identify resources that are missing from our natural succession, especially the resources that are going to be used by our focal wildlife. And then keep those resources fresh, kind of in the way that they should be existing naturally. And I'll talk about a few of these issues as we go through the different resources. But some things need to be refreshed annually, some things every 10 or 20 years. And it's just the way that their natural life cycle would exist. So if we're looking at an urban environment and contrasting it against a natural environment, commonly removed resources include the ecosystem engineers, especially burrowing animals. And that makes sense. Most people don't want to walk outside in an area that they were able to run around yesterday are now dodging, knee-deep holes that they could break their leg. Caves and crevices are typically removed as well. That's because they can be dangerous to structures, they can be dangerous for people. So it makes sense why they've been removed, but it's not great for wildlife. Large, clean, temporary water resources are also often removed, mostly because people are afraid of mosquitoes. And then the areas that we allow water to pool are typically polluted with chemicals from roadways, pesticides from people's yards, or sprayed intentionally with insecticides to reduce mosquito populations. Decomposing wood and leaf litter are typically removed from our urban environments that would naturally exist. Soil diversity, a lot of people don't think about, but both texture and slope are going to be important for various wildlife in their nesting and their hibernation sites. And then, of course, native plant communities. And a lot of articles right now focus on native plant communities, and there's wonderful presentations by people like Dr. Doug Tallamy and a number of other ecologists out there that highlight the importance of native plant communities. And I want this presentation to kind of be a complement to those ideas. And we'll talk about native plant communities, of course, but to realize that that's not the whole story. That's not the whole habitat that our wildlife really depend upon, especially our pollinators. But there's a number of other organisms that need these resources as well. So we're going to walk through all of those resources, and I'm going to talk about ways to bring them into your yard if you want to. So burrowing animals are typically removed from our urban landscapes. Think, prairie dogs, jackrabbits, coyotes, and those are ecosystem engineers. Especially in hot environments, these burrows are going to be important for animals to get into to escape the heat. And if we want to bring them back into our landscape, they're pretty easy to install if you're going to do any raised beds. And you can simply, if you're building up the walls, put in a sturdy pipe. And then if you want to even create a cave in the back, you can attach a container. You just want to make sure that there are sturdy walls and ceilings so this doesn't cave in on anything. You can also bury these in the ground if you want to do the digging. That's up to you. You absolutely want to make sure that they are covered by at least a foot or more of soil so they don't become ovens and start baking the animals that are taking shelter in those areas. You can also put these in shady areas to help keep those areas cool. If you have target wildlife like a box turtle, you want to make sure the tunnels are about 2 inches larger than your target wildlife so that they can get in there and not get stuck. And this will prevent larger organisms like raccoons or skunks from taking those areas and using them for their own hiding spots. There is no way to prevent other non-target wildlife species from utilizing these areas, though. So you can prevent larger organisms from using areas by making sure that it's small enough, but anything that is comfortable fitting in that space will try and fit in that space. So it's also important to monitor it to make sure that the species that are inhabiting it are ones that you want around and are safe for you to have. Make sure if you're using the plastic pipes that there are lots of holes in the bottom so it can drain and not become a drowning threat. And then if you don't use the pipes but just have sturdy walls and ceilings, you can loosen the soil on the bottom for organisms to bury themselves into and hibernate for longer periods of time or overwinter. Similar to burrows, caves are typically removed. In urban environments, a lot of people don't think about lizards, but you can create really nice focal rock work that lizards are also going to enjoy. Again, you're going to want to make sure that it's sturdy. And if a cat or a raccoon is chasing the lizard, you want to make sure that those rocks aren't going to wobble and crush the lizards as they're taking, as they are hiding from the threat that they have perceived or experienced. For lizard areas, it's also a good idea to plant some vegetation around your rock features because some animals would prefer to be in the vegetation instead of a dark hollow. To make this even more wildlife friendly, if you excavate the soil underneath first and loosen it up, this can become an area for various wildlife to lay their eggs, including lizards. Toads can overwinter in the area, and bees will even nest in these areas too if you amend the soils correctly. If you want a larger cave, maybe you're somebody who is adventurous and you want to attract coyotes, or you live in a place where large tortoises are going to exist. A number of people have started taking the tops off of kennels, placing them under a mound of soil, and then just decorating the front so that you hide the structure that is actually creating the den, and you have a denning environment. I'm currently working on a yard here in Midland where the landowner is interested in protecting some of the rabbits. So we're going to put one of these into a raised bed, and hopefully I'll have pictures in the future for us to look at. For large, clean, temporary water resources, these are missing in almost all landscapes simply because people don't want mosquitoes. In areas where the water is going to be perennial, a lot of people are adding fish and amphibians, dragonflies, and a number of other arthropods need fishless areas, which is why they typically colonize temporary wetlands or puddles. There's a lot of designs out there for rain retention gardens. This here is a picture of one from Stillwater, Oklahoma. This collects all of the water from the parking lot, which can be polluted with chemicals. It does do a really great job about feeding these plants, and then there is a spillway for when there's too much. If you want to incorporate a rain garden into your area, I recommend if you have gutters to simply just put a impervious layer by your spout, pull it away from your house and let it deposit into about a 9-inch deep basin. And you want to have this wide. If you're trying to encourage amphibians to carry out their life cycle in these ponds, make sure that there is various rock structures in there or shade so that the area doesn't bake and that they can escape raccoons and cats. You can plant a border around these as well with plants that are typically flooded or living in floodplains or playas, depending on where you live. And those will simply just have a different habitat so you can provide more plant species based on the water resources in your area. If you are familiar with the USDA websites for the plant fact sheets, you can check on the wetland tab, and selecting plants for this border, they're going to be listed as FAC, which means that they're facultative wetland plants and they tolerate drying out as well as having their feet wet for long periods of time. When we're thinking about urban landscapes, again, dead trees are typically removed. Again, it makes sense. They can be dangerous. You don't want them to fall over. And they're easy enough to add back into our landscapes. You can create borders of your planting bed with logs, simply use wooden pedestals in the area. And this will just create areas that wildlife can use. As the bark separates, a lot of lepidopterans need that area for pupating. Various beetles and horntails like to use dying wood as well. As trees decompose naturally, a lot of turtles will utilize those areas for nesting. A friend of mine in Connecticut had a tree taken out and mulched the pile down, and he found the next year that a snapping turtle had laid 22 eggs in there. So if you want to encourage these organisms to be in your area, it's easy enough, but you also want to keep your neighbors in mind. So of course, do it in a way that is aesthetically pleasing and within current ordinances. Another way to add wood into your environment, a typical decoration in beach towns is taking large pieces of wood and the people mow around them. You could easily plant around this as well. Knocked over trees when the tree roots are exposed, I've seen people utilize these in their yards as well and plant around them. And I am in no way encouraging you to go out to the forest and find one of these. But if you by chance happen to be in an area where a neighbor's tree falls down or a tree in your own yard, consider incorporating it into your landscape. And then a lot of people don't realize, but that's what bee hotels are also being utilized for. Many species of bee, about 30% of bees, nest in cavities. And naturally what's happening is beetle larvae are creating these tunnels and various other organisms create tunnels. And when they emerge, the bees have a clean cavity that they can go in and create a nest in. And there are a number of other arthropods that create nests in these cavities as well. When we remove all these dead wood and trees from our urban environments, there's no nesting sites for those bees, and then people are adding bee hotels. There's a few problems, however, with these bee hotels. Mostly that they are over concentrating the nest sites, and this allows for kleptoparasites, pollen mites, mildew to take over the area. These resources, if you're going to hang them up, they are fantastic, definitely worth putting into your yard, but they need to be monitored and they need to be cleaned. About every year or two, I recommend taking these down, placing them in a dark area or covering them with a plastic paper bag, not plastic. And that way the bees can emerge, fly out, but they won't want to come back and reuse it. Once all the bees have emerged, you can then take it away. If they're designed poorly, like this bee house here, which I used during my PhD, I didn't seal the sides well enough, and that allowed desiccation, which also happens in the wild as trunks crack. So it's important to make sure that you're using clean surfaces and that they are not going to accidentally harm the wildlife that you're trying to bring in. The bee hotels also normally support other arthropods, including spider hunting wasps like this one here, caterpillar hunting wasps, which can be great if you have a vegetable garden, but it's not a fabulous thing if you have a butterfly garden. So we need to be aware of which resources we're including and what species they're promoting. quite often get pictures from friends that are like, look how amazing this bee hotel is. And the only thing I see here is a massive undertaking of cleaning this every 2 years. So please do not build these. This is way too concentrated. The only thing this is going to do is develop a breeding site for pollen mites and kleptoparasites, especially if it's not cleaned. So having these large ones will do a really great job for about a year, but they're going to lead to a population crash, which is something we normally don't want. A lot of those articles also make people believe that most native bees are going to utilize them. But the reality is about 70% of the bees in North America are going to be ground nesting bees. And those bees need a diversity of soil, another resource that is typically removed from our urban environments. Soils are classified by three main components: sand, silt, and clay. And right here in the middle is what would be clay loam or sandy clay loam. Vegetable gardens typically end up in about this area because they drain well and retain moisture. Soils are also important to pay attention to how compact they are, thermal insulation, and how quickly they drain. In your garden and in urban landscapes, this pretty much gets homogenized, so you don't have a good diversity of soil. And it's easy enough to diversify your soil. So you can make areas with loosened, loamy areas where you want to have all your plants. You can amend certain areas to have sand to make sandy areas, and you can let areas be compacted with clay. If you're trying to encourage native bees to nest in your area, the few publications that have actually looked at native or at solitary bees nesting in soil have found those nests in these types of soils. But there's a caveat here. Less than 500 bee species have their nests described. And of those species, it's normally one or two nests that have been described. It's not looking at the entire variety or the range. So as we do more research, we'll probably find that there are bees that nest in these areas. But right now, the majority of the data that we have shows that these soils are preferred by bees, and you can start amending your soils to match that. Personally, I've done it and quite often get bees nesting, so it is sufficient. It just might not work for all bees. And then, of course, native plant communities are always removed from our urban environments, and they're, again, easy enough to include. You can use native plants in landscapes as much as possible. That's always a good idea. But when you're in urban areas, it's really important to follow design architecture guidelines and create beautiful aesthetics. A lot of people are just not mowing, getting a seed mix, letting it go wild, and then they're finding problems with the ordinances and the areas that they live. Not only is this a problem for ordinances, but it can also be dangerous for humans and the people around you. I grew up in California. Fire hazards are a real thing. And if you have a lot of yards with messy vegetation like this, it just becomes a fire hazard. My first job working in conservation was actually helping, part of it was helping landowners go through their yards and make sure that they were following ordinances so that they weren't creating fire hazards, even though they were still landscaping with natives. And it was a lot of fun. No matter where you live in the United States or in the world, really, there are going to be areas that you find aesthetically pleasing. And I recommend going to those areas and you finding the characteristics that you find attractive and then emulating them in your area. In areas of the eastern grasslands or the eastern Great Plains, we typically have these post oak savannas, nice strong browse lines, beautiful canopies, a pretty level area of flowers and herbaceous plants that if you were to do this in a garden, you could easily group these and have trails around. Outside of Albuquerque, exposed rock is common in mountainous areas where you will get these little cracks and divots that start getting populated by plants, very much reminiscent of a gardening bed and a patio. In alpine areas, you'll get a lot of trees, dead wood, paths, again, some structure, flowers, and you can just take these and shape them up a little bit to make them more aesthetically pleasing in urban areas. Even in the Mojave Desert and Sonoran Desert, you're going to have these washes that people like to walk along, really nice lush boundaries of shrubs, and then further out landscapes that draw your eye and attention. Stacked rocks exist in the wild. You can easily recreate these. And again, keep your yard from being simply a weedy lot. The other issue with people with yards that are typically done this way is it's harder to get in and make sure that invasives aren't growing. It's harder to get in and make sure that pests aren't taking over. So this has its place, but in a lot of urban landscapes, the full yard being covered like this isn't a great idea. If you're in a tight urban space, let's utilize this neighborhood as a really good example in the green box. If I was hired by this landowner to consult on their property, I would absolutely not recommend having something like this. You can see that xeriscaping is pretty common in these yards. That's exciting. There's a lot of tall trees, so planting a tall tree here wouldn't necessarily be beneficial to any of the wildlife because they could easily select the trees around there. But this landowner could attract those wildlife, be it birds, by providing food plants, be it pollinators, by providing pollinator plants. Due to the xeriscaping, I'd recommend that they start off with a rock border, put in some strong shrubs in that rock border that of course produce flowers or berries, have an ordered side along the driveway, and then having a low growing native ground cover. These planting areas you can easily pull out as to planting beds, and you can let one or two of them go crazy like a wild weedy area. But by doing that, when these intentional areas, your neighbors are going to less likely be upset and your ordinances will most easily be fulfilled as well. If you decide to let everything go wild, you can also simply organize this by color. Have your yellow flowers over here, purple flowers over here. As long as people can see that what you're doing is intentional, it's a lot easier to keep those neighbor relations and keep people around you happy and avoid tickets. When you're selecting the native plants, it's also important to pay attention to the species that exist in your area. The immediate considerations for any plant that you're choosing, make sure that it's within range, that it's going to be native, and that it's suitable for the habitat that you're planting in. If you have full sun, planting ferns is not going to be a good idea. But similarly, if you have full shade, planting a plant that requires full sun is not going to work. It's important to consider the shape of the flower as well as the bloom period. How long is that plant going to produce flowers? Understand how pollinators are using those plants. A number of plants have extrafloral nectaries where animal or pollinators are utilizing those oils or those nectaries to carry on their life cycle, as well as some plants produce hairs that certain pollinators like to use as well. Overall insect use, what are the pests, what type of butterflies can develop on it, or what type of moths. And then also it's important to consider bird use. Does it produce seeds that the birds can eat as adults? Is it going to produce a lot of insects that the birds can feed as young? Doug Tallamy again covers a lot of these aspects. And with the articles that are published and available to the public right now, a lot of the plants that are listed are simply listed because honeybees feed on them. And that's not a great reality. So in the book that I have coming out, I've decided to go through and look at the research data that we have, which bees have been collected on these plants. And I ignore bumblebees and honeybees because there are a lot of resources on those groups of bees and not our solitary bees. This plant, the blanket flowers of the firewheel, is a great, highly visited plant and flower, and it supports a couple of different species of Shinia moths. Blooms most of the growing season, doesn't require a lot of water. This is a great plant that typically gets left off of pollinator lists nonetheless. Similarly, plants are not all designed the same. So even though this species overlaps and exists in an area where a lot of bee research has been conducted, there still isn't a lot of data for the number of bee species that utilize this plant. There is a decent record of which moths can grow on it. So when we're looking at plants, yes, having more plants is important, but understanding that not all flowers are created equal for pollinators is important to consider. Another good example of this is milkweed is really entering conversations thanks to monarchs. And I've done a lot of research on monarchs and publications on those, and I even have some publications on milkweed as well. Milkweeds are great for pollinators. They are great for bees because they produce copious amounts of nectar, and adult bees need nectar to carry on their life cycle. However, the pollen that milkweeds produce It's produced in pollinia, and you can see it covering this honeybee right here. These pollen sacs are not utilized by any bee that we know of to feed to their young, and it's because of the way that they are packaged. But the nectar resources of milkweed are fabulously important to them and many other arthropods. So definitely plant milkweeds, even if you're not in the monarch migratory areas, because so many species utilize them. Another great thing about milkweeds is many of them are fire adapted. So if they seed, you can cut them back and those will regrow their vegetation and reflower that season. If they don't get cut back, they'll simply senesce and then come back the following year. With the articles that are out there about milkweed, however, there are 72 species of milkweed in North America, and about 10 species are really well studied. And those are the ones that exist within the monarch flyways that go through central Texas up to Minnesota and all the way over in California are your target species. With some of the work that I've been doing, I started collecting data on bract milkweed, and we published the second paper on bract milkweed and the first one to look at its ecology. The other paper force-fed it to goats, killed the goats. So it vilified it by farmers because it absolutely made them believe that this is super bad for livestock, even though you wouldn't typically find livestock feeding on this plant that is so poisonous. The research that we did, we were able to document a variety of herbivores, a number of predators feeding on the insects that were growing on the plants, a number of seed eaters, and a variety of floral visitors as well. Interestingly, we were able to show that wild populations have differing levels of cardinalides, and these are some of the highest cardinalide concentrations that we have recorded in the Asclepias genus. The offspring, however, grown in lab conditions, all have roughly the same amount of cardinalides, so this seems to be an environmental influence. This is important when it comes to monarchs and possibly queen butterflies, as they're both affected by OE, which is a neogregorian parasite that affects them. And when they are sick when monarchs are sick with that parasite, they typically lay their eggs on more toxic milkweeds in an effort to prevent their larvae from succumbing to it and dying and making it to adulthood. So like I said, only about 10 species are well studied of milkweed, but milkweeds we do know are an important plant, and we can utilize them as a model for the way other plants are going to play into the ecosystem as well. Milkweeds are the larval host plant for milkweed beetles, aphids, tussock moths, Cisnia moths, large and small milkweed bugs, queen butterflies, as well as monarch butterflies. So planting milkweeds is beneficial to all of those insects, not just the monarch butterfly. The nectar resource is important for a number of pollinators and non-pollinators as well. And all of these organisms are going to fit into the landscape and interact with all these other plants, resources. So if by planting it in your gardens, you're going to increase the overall diversity of the area, which is always exciting. Monarchs are arguably one of the better studied butterflies, especially ecologically, due to their large size and their declines. We can utilize them again as a model for what other lepidopterans are going through, because again, most insects are poorly studied. So with just the monarch life cycle, we know that in the egg and early larval stage, certain predators like ants and lacewings are more of a problem than later on when you have predatory insects like wheel bugs and soldier bugs that will gladly feed on larger caterpillars. Parasitoid flies like the chicken fly pictured here are a problem. And then during the pupal stage, Pteromalus cassotis, this insect right here, is a huge problem. In the first publication we have on this insect, we found one site that had 100% infection rates of this pupal parasitoid. Later research, after that paper was published, I found a second site where again that happened. So this parasitoid can knock out a full habitat for monarchs. Aspesia or this tachinid fly has not been found to reach those rates, but it has been found to have high parasitization rates. So we can assume this is true for many other butterflies and moths as well. To give you a visual representation, I'm not going to read through this, but for the egg predators, there's all of these different arthropods that are known to attack the monarchs. And then in the larval stages, all of these organisms are known to attack it. So we can assume, again, that your painted ladies, your pipevine swallowtails, the tiger moths that are flying around in the summer, all of these are going to have some level of parasitization and different predators and natural enemies that they have to face and overcome at different points of their life cycle. We can also make assumptions from well-studied organisms like this that their cousins or sister species are also going to be affected by similar threats. So the queen butterfly, which has overlapping range, is known to be infected by OE. We know has many of the same parasitoids and predators as monarchs. They are migratory on a small scale, and their larvae also feed on Asclepias plants. So again, by planting milkweed, you're helping more than just the monarchs, which is exciting. When we are looking at an area and thinking about it in a conservation scale, it's important to realize the difference between what a healthy organism is and a healthy population. Most people easily understand what a healthy organism is because that's what we think about when we think about ourselves. Like, am I healthy? Is the animal I'm taking care of healthy? And you know to look at the vitals, the illness, the parasites, etc. How is the animal doing? But on a population scale, you know that some members are going to be sick. You know that some are going to die. So it is measured by the health of the population is measured by the reproductive success, the parasitism rates, and then how much of that population is dying each year and how much is being replaced. To get your head around those, it's also important to understand the ecology. How are these organisms moving around? How are they interacting in the healthy ecosystem? And again, a healthy ecosystem is going to have shifting vegetation communities. It's going to be dynamic. It's going to support a wide variety of habitats and species populations, along with things that eat those species. An unhealthy ecosystem simply has too much of something, too many hosts, too many predators, too many parasitoids, you name it. When there's an imbalance, that's when we start running into problems. In my experience, conservation managers, gardeners typically make the mistake that they try and do too much for one species, and that creates a high density of the target species. And then they're not monitoring what's going on. So the good intentions for a species that's also benefiting the target species natural enemies starts to lead to an imbalance. And in many cases, the areas that are being managed are really helping the non-target species and actually harming the target species. So if we're thinking about a meadow, again, we talked about it at the beginning, in a forested ecosystem, life is about 25 years. So those populations need to move around, which means the natural enemies also have to move around and find new hosts each time that those habitats start shifting. In the landscape, the wildlife populations are, of course, going to grow and shrink between years, and in local areas, it's common for them to disappear, also known as an extirpation. Natural enemies typically drive this, and instead of going out and looking at the entire population, Hansky et al. Realized there was a better way to do this. So with the endangered Glanville fritillary in Europe, they went out and started to map habitats within the range. And then instead of going out every year and trying to take a population census, they realized they could just go to each habitat, mark if Glanville fritillaries were present or absent. And then as long as a certain number of these habitats were inhabited, which for this species was 30%, the population was doing fine and was moving and shifting throughout the landscape. Then Hansky et al. Decided, well, let's go back. Why are some of these areas not inhabited, year after year, and other ones are? And what they realized is that the areas that had the most host plants and a lot of floral resources, something that would arguably look like an inspiration for a pollinator garden, those had the highest likelihood of hosting parasitoids. So the populations of the butterfly would boom, and then the parasitoids would make it in, and the parasitoids would crash the population to zero. So the really healthy pollinator gardens were blinking on and off. They also found that the areas that weren't considered fantastic habitat were the ones that were typically inhabited year after year, and that's because the parasitoids simply weren't able to get a strong foothold to cause a 100% loss of the population. So when we're talking about pollinator gardens and we start to understand that a beautiful pollinator garden that has so many nectar resources and typically has too many floral or larval resources, that's just going to drive a natural enemy parasitoid population more so than it will our target population. A good example of this is on a yard or an area that I consulted with in Corpus Christi. This is actually the client that made me start charging for consultations because they wanted to hear advice and didn't want to take any of it. And they planted a bed for monarchs. They used non-native milkweeds, and they didn't intersperse this at all. So in about 2 months, these plants went from the containers they were planted in to twigs. The monarchs and queen butterflies quickly found these host plants, decimated them. This is going to attract a lot of predators and natural enemies. And it also caused a lot of monarchs to die because monarchs were leaving the plants that they were eating, moving over to another shrub, and then pupated on it as caterpillars were defoliating it, which allowed them to be exposed to the sun and cook in the chrysalis. A much better design is shown up here in the top, where milkweeds, native milkweeds nonetheless, have been interspersed. And there are yarrows and other native plants, clump grasses, areas for caterpillars to move off to shed their skin between larval instars and pupate and carry on their life cycles. This is also going to reduce the risk of creating too many volatiles from these plants that are going to attract the things to eat the caterpillars. So this will most likely add more monarchs to the population overall than an ecosystem setup like this. So tips for your areas, no matter which caterpillar you are trying to support, spread those host plants throughout the yard. Make sure there are shaded areas so that the caterpillars can find that to pupate. A number of caterpillars will also bury in the ground. So make sure that you understand the life cycle that's going on. When possible, change out your host plants every few years. And I don't mean replace your milkweeds with more milkweeds. What I mean is let your community shift a little bit. If your milkweed plants start to look a little bad, feel free to plant some anise and support the pipevine or swallowtail population for a little bit. And you can do this, to keep things fresh and new in your garden, but also help your overall ecosystem stay active and diverse and dynamic as it's supposed to be. And then, of course, avoid using pesticides. When I say pesticides, what I mean is everything. Don't use herbicides, don't use fungicides, don't use insecticides unless you really have to. Insecticides are, of course, designed to kill insects, so that's going to harm bees and butterflies. But some of the research that I did during my postdoc found that fungicides were more harmful to bumblebees than sublethal exposure to insecticides. And what the fungicides were doing was harming their immune system. That was allowing them to succumb to infections from both natural, native, and invasive pathogens. More research has shown that herbicides, when they're applied with a surfactant or a soap. And when bees are directly sprayed, they quickly die because they drown or get stuck or glued together. So these are a problem. In short, try your best not to use pesticides because there's only a few insects that we know what's going on, and all of them is showing that it's bad. No matter which group of insects that we're looking at, there's going to be a large majority of those insects that are poorly studied. For example, the US has 4,000 species of bees. More than 300 species have only one digital record. That's almost 10%, that we don't know even what the range of these bees are going to be, let alone their floral diets. Or even know their nesting structure. North America, what has led to this is that North American bee species have mostly been studied by a handful of biologists since the 1800s, and most of those biologists targeted the Mojave Desert, Sonoran Desert, and parts of California. There have also been a few monitoring programs that have been released in Maryland and parts of Colorado. So some areas are well studied for the communities, but again, we don't know a lot about the species that are there. Just to kind of drive this point home, in Los Angeles, entomologists under a challenge went out and sampled the insects that were in Los Angeles County, a highly developed, lots of access to museums, and they were still able to discover 30 species in the small sampling period that they did. So there are a lot of species out there that we haven't even described, let alone the ones that we have described. We don't know what they eat. We don't know when they fly. We don't even know how they're interacting with the resources. So the more diverse that we can make our ecosystems, the more wildlife we can end up supporting. Another group of bees to kind of drive this home, Ashmeadiella is a paper that I recently published with a team of fabulous researchers. And this is the first paper that looked at this genus of bees on its ecology as well as its genetic diversity. This genus has about 61 described species. We know that there are 5 undescribed species. There's probably even more than that. They occur all throughout the arid regions of Western North America, and there are 2 species found throughout the East Coast and up into Canada. There are groups within this genus that will forage on a lot of flowers, which is called polylectic, and there is a number that will only forage on a few species, which is called oligolectic. The nesting sites are also pretty diverse, so you can have species that are going to create tunnels in wood or use cavities. They'll use hollowed out stems under rocks. Snail shells have even been used, and excavated terrestrial tunnels. So this genus has all the nesting behaviors of solitary bees that we know of, which is kind of fantastic. We were able to do DNA sequencing on just over half of the species in the genus, and I also collected all of the collection data on when they fly. There are 4 species where we can't even give you a good window of when these bees are going to fly, let alone what their range is going to be. If you're interested, feel free to reach out to me. This is just a phylogeny, which species are more closely related to the others. And oligolecty did seem to group out, and then polylecty was spread out across the genus. So with that in mind, understanding that even though we know bees exist in our neighborhoods, but we don't know what they're feeding on, and we know that pesticides are bad, people typically ask me, how do I start doing some conservation? Unfortunately, a lot of the places that I consult on, I don't do the work myself, so I don't have photos. However, this is my front yard in the house I recently moved into, and it's about 2 years of work. What I can recommend for everyone doing this type of work, especially if you're doing it yourself, is start small. Install 1 bed or area at a time. Plant your shrubs, your trees, and your large rocks first. This is simply because, especially your large rocks, so that it's easier to get to where you want to place them. Once you get an area solidly set aside, then you can keep expanding. So this is about 7 months of work between these 2 pictures. Then you want to have strong borders so the neighbors can see what you're doing is intentional. This is actually a research setup. So I have large gravel sand on this side, small grain sand on this side. Bees quickly started nesting over here. Nothing has nested in this larger gravel, so that's good to know. Again, structure and order, adding in native plants. These are red yucca, which are native to the area, various cacti. The amended soils that I've mixed into this as well started attracting nesting bees pretty quickly, and as time has gone on, more and more insects are nesting. We also have had a ton of toads show up and overwinter along these areas where we've disturbed the dirt, and they've been able to bury themselves throughout the winter. And I'm excited to see what emerges this spring. We're also documenting a ton of Lepidoptera in this area. Various birds visit our yard and none of the others. And we're even finding lizards, which is exciting. This was the progress until late fall. Here is the yard. Once we figured out which plants were going to start growing and come up, we created various beds, put in some rock cover just to help maintain what's going on, and again, keep the neighbors happy. And then let some of these further areas start to go wild so the insects are happy. Easy enough to incorporate, and again, keep it within the ordinances and regulations and keeping your neighbors happy. This is how the yard looked today, just to give you an idea. And as this yard progresses, things are going to grow in. This is a slow growing yucca. We have these red yuccas, which will grow in. And I do have non-native plants in here. I am not a proponent of pushing native plants, but definitely don't plant invasives. In this situation with climate change, we keep having really long stretches of warm periods in January and December. I am trapping bees during those times and doing floral surveys. There are no flowers, but we have bees out. and the non-native plants are the only ones producing flowers. So I am incorporating them, including dandelions, into our yards so that these bees can at least have a nectar resource that they can make it to when the plants that they need to feed their young start blooming. With that, I want to leave you all in conclusion with this stone that if you visit Carlsbad, New Mexico, you can find it by the spring. And in short, you don't need to read the whole thing. But what it's saying is that before colonials arrived, when the Mescalero Apache lived on their land, that this spring flowed at hundreds of gallons per minute. And today, due to the increased number of landowners that have drilled water wells in the La Huerta area, that spring is merely a trickle. It's producing less than 5 gallons at some points of the year. So if these resources can be decimated one landowner at a time, they can also be restored one person and 1 yard at a time. So when you are designing your area, don't feel like you aren't doing anything. You are part of a movement, and it is going to help wildlife. It's going to help our environment, even though it can be kind of daunting when we look at the world today. Great example is Tim Wong, during his postdoc in San Francisco, realized the California pipevine swallowtail had disappeared from the San Francisco Peninsula because it needs a specific plant for its host plant. He went to the botanic garden, got a couple cuttings, started a little butterfly garden in his backyard specifically for this butterfly, and there is now a whole group of people, hundreds of people in the San Francisco area, trying to promote this butterfly to repopulate the San Francisco Peninsula. So the work that we're doing, it is possible to get our neighbors involved and really bring back the ecosystems and the wildlife that exists in these areas. And with that, I will open it up for questions.
Thanks, Shaun. That was great.